We'll have heard this week a huge amount about the judiciary and about the Judicial Service Commission. The Commission said this week it was going to adopt the decision of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal that the Western Cape Judge President John Hlophe is guilty of gross misconduct and should be impeached. In other words, this goes to the National Assembly. It's understood 8 members of the Commission voted to uphold the findings of the tribunal, 4 voted against. The JSC has promised to publish the reasons of why different commissioners voted in the way that they did. I have to tell you, as I speak to you now, I've not yet seen the reasons yet. I'm also not entirely sure as to who voted which way. At the same time, the organisation Judges Matter said this week that time is beginning to run out for President Cyril Ramaphosa to nominate and then go through the process of appointing a new Chief Justice. The term of office of the current Chief Justice, Mogoeng, runs out in a couple of months. Well, joining us to discuss all of this, Lawson Naidoo is Executive Secretary of CASAC. Chris Oxley is a Senior Researcher for the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit at the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town. Advocate Paul Hoffman's at Accountability Now. Good afternoon to you, gentlemen. Lawson Naidoo, let me start with you. The decision by the JSC to start the impeachment process of Judge Hlophe, to actually adopt the Judicial Conduct Tribunal report, I mean, this has gone on for 13 years. Do you believe there is now going to be a conclusion to this?
Well, good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you. Well, I think we're certainly much closer to a conclusion now. Now that the JSC has confirmed the decision of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal, which was taken in April of this year, and the matter has now been referred to the Speaker of the National Assembly, Parliament now needs to consider a resolution for the removal of the Judge President of the Western Cape Division, John Hlophe, from office as the judicial officer. There's been some speculation that Parliament doesn't have rules to deal with it in the same way that it previously didn't have rules for the heads of Chapter 9s. I think it's important to clarify that Parliament doesn't need any special rules for this. A finding of gross misconduct has already been made by the Judicial Conduct Tribunal and now by the JSC itself. And Parliament simply needs to process that through a resolution. Parliament is not required to go through another hearing on the matter. So hopefully that matter can be scheduled fairly soon and this matter can be resolved finally.
Chris, one of the issues about this decision, as I understand it, is that 4 of the commissioners of the Judicial Service Commission in this meeting voted against upholding the decision. So they said the process to impeach Hlophe should not continue. I suppose the other way to look at it, in essence, they rejected the tribunal's findings. Are you surprised by that?
Not particularly, Stephen. I mean, I think it's been such a contentious issue that's dragged on for, as you've alluded to, 13 years and counting. I think it was always likely that there was going to be a split of some description in the Judicial Service Commission. I frankly was partly expecting that a decision similar to what was made in the case of Judge Matata might come out here, where the JSC would have not recommended impeachment. So this is a monumental step, and I think some dissent is not too surprising. Perhaps some of the reasoning will be, I'm sure, will be dissected in the coming weeks. But I think that, as I say, given the level of contention that this matter has had, I think the split was not too much of a surprise.
Chris, how important is it for you that we find out who voted which way? Maybe more important than that is what their reasons were. I mean, it might be easy to say, how can you reject the finding of a tribunal? But these are, the best legal minds in the country on the JSC. They might well have really good reasons. Something to do with the reasoning of the process. They might be concerned about a court challenge, for example. How important is it for us to actually see the arguments that went both ways here?
I mean, vitally important for the transparency of the process, the accountability of the JSC itself. So as far as I'm aware, reasons have been released. They maybe haven't been as widely publicly disseminated as they might have been, but the reasons have been released. I must confess, Stephen, like you haven't had the chance to go through both decisions line by line at this point. The one core finding that has stuck with me from the minority was a finding that Judge President Hlophe's conduct did not even constitute misconduct, let alone gross misconduct, which I think for many people will be quite raise a few eyebrows. And I think that's something certainly that will be discussed at more length.
Advocate Paul Hoffman from Accountability Now joins us. He's been watching this for many years as well. Paul Hoffman, good afternoon to you. You're with Lawson Naidoo and Chris Oxtoby. This issue of the Judicial Service Commission, 4 commissioners voting not to uphold the decision of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal, 8 voting to actually uphold the decision. Were you surprised that 4 people voted against it?
Well, we did know. Hello, Stephen, and hello, fellow panelists. Pardon my tardiness. I got stuck in traffic. It's Friday. I forgot. The difficulty is that the JSC has been divided along political lines rather than along legal lines since its inception. In my humble opinion, the JSC has too many politicians, some of them professional and some of them amateur, featuring in its ranks. And as a consequence of that, legal decision-making that falls on the shoulders of the JSC is not made in accordance with legal principles, which are well established and universally known. It's made in accordance with political expediency. And I'm afraid that is why we have a divided decision in this matter, and why it is going to open the door to all sorts of further abuse, like a review and an appeal if the review is not a success, and a challenge to the rules that the Parliament will have to put in place in order to have an impeachment hearing. And the retirement date of the Judge President Hlophe is May 2024. The legal processes that will flow from this particular farce will take him way beyond his retirement date. And the argument at the end of the day will really be, does this man deserve a pension or does he not deserve a pension? And he will have many a loyal comrade in the ranks of the ANC in Parliament who will think it churlish not to allow him to keep his pension. So I don't see an impeachment happening, and I see this latest development as yet another stone in the road of the proper upholding of the rule of law in South Africa.
Lawson Naidoo, I mean, you hear the criticism from Paul Hoffman of the Judicial Service Commission, and you yourself in CASAC, the organisation that you're the executive director of, I mean, you've actually threatened court action, gone to court, and before even the case was heard, won recently around the issue of the latest round of interviews that the Judicial Service Commission held. But there's a bigger issue here. Do we expect the Judicial Service Commission to be completely united in decisions? I mean, does it matter that there's a division? I would think maybe a little bit of argument would be a good thing.
Well, indeed, Stephen. The fact that there's been a majority and a minority decision on this matter, that happens all the time. There are differences of opinion all the time. I think what's important is, as Chris alluded to earlier, is the reasoning behind the decisions of the minority in particular, I guess, in this case. And if, as Chris alludes to, the fact that the minority says there wasn't even misconduct, let alone gross misconduct, and that's a serious issue. And it points to the intentions behind that minority report. To a certain extent, Paul Hoffman is correct. The JSC has been driven by political issues in recent times, but I think it's important to note that the so-called small JSC that is set to consider this matter does not include politicians amongst its ranks. So it's the non-political politicians that constitute the JSC that took this decision, and hence the 8-4 split. But those issues are clearly critical, but I think we've got to move beyond that now. And I think the onus is on Parliament is to move ahead with this and, let Judge President Hlophe challenge these issues in court if he likes, but let Parliament take a decision first so that if he is removed from office, that he challenges this after he's been impeached.
Chris Oxtoby, one of the arguments now, it seems to me, is not going to be so much about whether Parliament should impeach. I think that argument will certainly come. I wouldn't be surprised if there's court action on this. I suspect the next debate or next argument, I mean, as lawyers, so I'd like to use the word debate, but argument might turn out to be more accurate, is whether or not the Judge President of the Western Cape should be suspended, because as I understand it, the JSC can now make that recommendation to the President.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And the JSC has called on both parties, so both the Judge President and the complainant judges of the Constitutional Court to make submissions as to whether or not the JSC should recommend suspension to the president. So that is again another rock in the road, to coin Advocate Hoffman's expression. And what the outcome of that will be and when we can expect to receive a decision on that point, we'll wait and see, as with so many aspects of this issue.
It's really interesting, that, Paul Hoffman, because you would expect that one would follow the other. A decision to adopt the report of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal and to recommend to Parliament that a person be impeached would seem to mean that immediately after that would come the recommendation to suspend. Advocate Hoffman, that hasn't necessarily happened here. There's going to be another process.
Yes, I'm afraid once again the exercise of the legal discretion which is given to the president to suspend or not to suspend will be bedeviled by political considerations. And if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would bet on Judge Hlophe not being suspended because of the political considerations, because of the size of the minority view, and because the president is not known for his decisiveness.
There's a lot to be said with that. Gentlemen, we need to change the conversation, move away from the Western Cape Judge President Judge Hlophe, but move a little bit to the issue of Chief Justice. Now, the term of office of the current Chief Justice, Mogoeng, comes to an end soon. He's actually on a sabbatical at the end of his term. There's been a suggestion from the organisation Judges Matter that there should be a new process. Now, what's happened in the past, if my memory serves, is that the President's nominated someone, the Judicial Service Commission has held a hearing, and essentially that nomination has been confirmed. Lawson Naidoo, is that the best way, or should we take Judges Matter seriously and look at a different way of doing it?
No, I fully support the proposal that's made by Judges Matter. I think, and the President alluded to this when he was giving evidence before the Zondo Commission a few weeks ago, that he was considering a process similar to that which he followed for the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the appointment of the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, where an independent panel was put in place to advise the President on candidates that he should consider. And I very much hope that the President will in fact follow a similar process here, that it needs to be an open process, and that we need to consider a number of candidates and find the right person for this job. This is a critically important position. It's not just the head of the Constitutional Court, it's the head of the Office of the Chief Justice, which is a government department now that manages the higher courts in South Africa. And it's also, critically, the chairperson of the Judicial Service Commission, the body that we've just been speaking about. So it's an incredibly important position. The President needs independent advice, and he needs to consider the merits of certainly more than one candidate.
The issue, though, and I mean, Chris Oxbeer, let me put this to you, is that there is already a panel. And I mean, it is the Judicial Service Commission. With SARS, there was no such thing. With the National Prosecuting Authority, there was no such thing.
Yes, that's quite correct. And I would imagine that the kind of process we're discussing here would not be a duplication of the JSC process. And I'm sure the President, if he does go this road, will be careful not to tread on toes and duplicate what the JSC will be doing. But I do think it would be highly surprising if the President and those advising him were not considering more than one name for the position. And why not in that case have that consideration of the qualities of the various candidates discussed and debated in a more public forum? I mean, as you've alluded to earlier, Stephen, the past practice, certainly the two previous appointments of Chief Justices that I've observed, it's simply been the case of the presidency announcing that person X is my chosen candidate. The consultation process that the Constitution requires with the JSC and with members of other political parties in the National Assembly takes place. And then inevitably the President's appointment is confirmed. And if you think back to the controversy around the appointment of the current Chief Justice, and I think a great deal of that came from the fact that the process was not seen to be very credible, because certainly at the JSC level, everything was rather seen as a fait accompli, despite how taxing that particular interview was. So I think that yes, that process can be fine-tuned to avoid duplicating the JSC. but let's have a discussion and an engagement around some specific criteria about who the people who should be consulted on can be.
Paul Hoffman, there might be another concern around this, which is that, okay, you're going to change the process to nominate and go through the process of appointing a new Chief Justice. But you can also end up with a very politicized process. There'll be different constituencies in society who will demand to have their candidate on a panel because they have particular questions. We've seen political parties trying to really politicize the issue of the judiciary recently. Paul, is that a problem? Is that a risk?
Yes, I do believe it is a risk, and I would much prefer that the preponderance of personalities on the JSC, which is, as Chris suggests, the appropriate body to advise the president on this sort of appointment, ought to be more retired judges, representatives of the faith-based community, representatives of trade unions and business, that broader perspective, so that the politicization of the work of the JSC is diluted and improved, which is an unusual combination, because usually when things get diluted, they do not improve, much like the whiskey in your glass this evening.
No comment about my future plans under level 3 of the lockdown, Paul Hoffman. Lawson, Nadia, there is a sort of series of issues around all of this. If I were a member of the Judicial Service Commission and there was another panel, and then that panel interviewed people, and then the committee interviewed people, I'd be a bit annoyed. I mean, I might say, well, hold on, constitutionally, the Judicial Service Commission has a responsibility here. Let them do their job. I mean, it would be interesting to see the Judicial Service Commission interview more than one candidate for the position of Chief Justice. But as I say, and as we've already discussed in this conversation, I mean, politics would enter at the Judicial Service Commission level as well. I mean, inevitably.
Well, look, Stephen, I think the important thing here is not to duplicate issues. In my understanding of this is that whatever independent panel the President puts together will make recommendations to the President on 2 or 3 candidates, for example. The President, in terms of the Constitution, is required to consult with the JSC and with the leaders of political parties represented in the National Assembly before making his decision. The practice has been that the JSC then interviews those candidates to confirm their suitability to hold office. So there's nothing to stop that from happening. Ultimately, the decision rests with the President. But I think one does want to avoid the situation where there are 2 sets of interviews by 2 different bodies. That, I think, could cause some confusion.
Chris Oxtoby, I mean, you've gone through all of these hearings. I remember very, very clearly the interview with Chief Justice Mogoeng. I was there at the time, and it went on for over a day, went through to lunchtime on the second day. Tensions really flew. And I mean, in a way, there was a structural problem. The person who had been passed over, then Deputy Chief Justice Teko Moseneke, essentially had to chair the interview of the person who was taking the job that he had been passed over for. I mean, it was an incredibly complex thing. There's got to be a better way than that.
Well, one would think so, Stephen, but it's also entirely possible that we could be in a similar situation now, because my understanding of the Chief Justice's long leave is that we don't see him again, that is the Chief Justice Mogoeng, that we don't see him again in an official capacity before his tenure ends. And that being the case, the Constitution of the JSC Act, I forget which, but requires that the Deputy Chief Justice would step in. The Deputy Chief Justice, we have to assume, will be one of the candidates that is being considered. So it may be that chairing of the JSC has to be delegated elsewhere. But we could potentially see that situation being repeated. It is a bit anomalous, and I must just say part of the anomaly, I think, is these appointments. This appointment seems to have been left quite late. It was a similar problem to what we had in 2011, because there was the attempt to extend Chief Justice Mobo's tenure, which failed, and therefore he was out of office when the interview happened. And I'm a little concerned that the clock is ticking, and that we may therefore find ourselves in a similar situation now.
I do wonder if, as a nation, we've just asked already too much of Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Paul Hoffman, how worried are you about that problem, about the fact that the clock is ticking on this?
Yes, it is indeed a concern. I don't see Deputy Chief Justice Zondo as a candidate, mainly because he as you say, he's done his bit, but he's also very close to retirement. And so we'd have to go through the whole show again quite soon if he were to be made Chief Justice for a short period of time. I'm not, as Chris will know, I'm not quite sure when his retirement date is due, but it's not long. It's a matter of a couple of years at most. So I suppose one has to scour around the upper deck of the Constitutional Court and the leadership of the Supreme Court of Appeal and the busier divisions in South Africa. And it's too invidious to name names, so I won't. But that is quite a small pool of potential candidates. Some won't want the job, others might. And if it is done on that sort of basis, and that this informal Shamila Batoyi kind of selection process is presided over by someone of real stature in the ranks of the retired judiciary, I think we could get to a happy ending. The talent and the skill and the clout of the retired judges in South Africa is an underutilized national treasure. So that is something that could, I believe, profitably be looked at as a solution to the infighting and the really terrible spectacle that Dikgang Moseneke presiding over the interview of soon-to-be Chief Justice Mogoeng. While you were there, Stephen, you know it was a disastrous occasion.
It was very difficult indeed. Lawson Nadu, Paul Hoffman's not going to name any names. Do you have any idea of who might be the next Chief Justice who you think the President's watching?
For once, I agree with Paul Hoffman. I also would hesitate to name any names. The one point I do want to make, though, Stephen, is, whilst the clock is ticking, and I think there's literally about 6 weeks before Chief Justice Mogoeng vacates office, and ideally we would want the new candidate to be announced before that, so that's a smooth handover or transition. I doubt very much whether there will actually be any handover of any sort. But I think it's more important that process is a good one, is full of transparency and integrity, and that the right choice is made rather than forcing the President into rushing into a decision. If the Deputy Chief Justice is acting at the moment, needs to act for another 2 or 3 months, I don't think that's the end of the world for the court. I think it's much more important to make the right decision, for the President to apply his mind properly to the process, as well as the ultimate candidate. So I wouldn't put that kind of pressure on the presidency right now.
Lawson Nadu, I really appreciate the time. Thank you, Executive Director of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, Chris Oxtoby, Senior Researcher at the Democratic Governance and Rights Institute for the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town, Paul Hoffman, Director of Accountability Now. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time this Friday afternoon on Newsfeed. Important conversations around the issue of the Chief Justice. 6 weeks or so until the term of the current Chief Justice comes to an end.